Audie Murphy revealed the 6 Golden Age stars he hated most. He was America's most decorated combat soldier of World War II, a warrior who single-handedly held off 6 German tanks and 250 infantry, killing or wounding 50 enemy soldiers, and earning every medal for valor his country could bestow, including the Medal of Honor. When Audie Murphy came to Hollywood, he brought with him not just battlefield heroism, but an unflinching moral code forged in the crucible of combat. Audie wasn't just another actor playing a hero, revealed a former Universal Pictures executive who worked closely with Murphy during the 1950s. He had witnessed real courage and genuine cowardice on the battlefield. He'd seen men sacrifice everything for their brothers and others who broke under pressure. That experience gave him a black and white view of character that Hollywood's gray areas couldn't blur. Unlike most stars who carefully avoided public criticism of colleagues, Murphy maintained private but unyielding judgments about fellow actors whose behavior or values violated his combat-forged principles. For a man who had faced death countless times in Europe, Hollywood pretense and posturing held no intimidation factor. He didn't play politics or worry about career advancement, explained a co-star who became one of Murphy's few genuine Hollywood friends. While other actors were networking at parties, Audie was home with his family or with fellow veterans. He viewed many of Hollywood's biggest names with a contempt he rarely bothered to hide in private conversations. Tonight, we reveal the 6 Golden Age stars who reportedly earned Audie Murphy's deepest disdain. Hollywood icons whose behavior or attitudes so thoroughly violated the combat veteran's moral code that he refused to work with them, associate with them, or even pretend respect for their accomplishments. But first, we need to understand why Murphy, a reluctant actor who struggled with his own demons, developed such uncompromising judgments of his Hollywood contemporaries, and why his battlefield-forged perspective makes his assessments uniquely meaningful even decades later.
A little about Texas, but that's something no Texan can talk about just a little. So instead, I'd like to talk about some of the men who have made Texas what it is.
The war hero behind the Hollywood facade. Born to impoverished Texas sharecroppers during the Depression, Audie Murphy's early life was defined by hardship. His father abandoned the family, and his mother died when he was a teenager, leaving young Audie to care for his younger siblings before he volunteered for military service after Pearl Harbor. Initially rejected by the Marines and paratroopers as too small and underweight, Murphy finally found a home in the infantry where his unassuming appearance concealed extraordinary courage and lethal effectiveness. Murphy wasn't some bigger-than-life physical specimen, noted a fellow veteran who served with him in Europe. He stood 5 feet 5 inches and weighed about 130 pounds soaking wet. What set him apart was a quiet intensity and seemingly supernatural calm under fire. When other men froze, Audie acted, without hesitation, without grandstanding, without regard for his own safety. This authenticity, doing rather than talking, risking rather than posturing, became the foundation of Murphy's moral code, one he carried to Hollywood after the war when his Medal of Honor made him a national hero. Universal Studios, seeing the potential in his remarkable story and boyish good looks, offered him a contract despite his lack of acting experience or interest. Audie never particularly wanted to be an actor, explained a longtime friend. He saw films as a way to provide for his family, and occasionally to ensure that America didn't forget the realities of war. He viewed Hollywood with a perpetual outsider's skepticism, a fundamentally artificial world populated largely by people playing pretend versions of experiences he had lived for real. This unique perspective, a combat veteran's unflinching assessment of an industry built on illusion, shaped Murphy's uncompromising judgments of his fellow performers. Unlike critics or journalists with careers dependent on industry relationships, Murphy had no professional reason to temper his opinions or pretend respect for stars whose character or conduct violated his combat-forged standards. Audie had seen men die for values like courage, loyalty, and sacrifice, said a director who worked with Murphy on multiple films. When he encountered Hollywood figures who casually disrespected those values, whether through draft dodging, German sympathies, or simple moral cowardice, his contempt wasn't just professional disapproval, it was the genuine disgust of a man who had held dying friends in his arms for the principles others treated as convenient publicity angles. Now let's explore the 6 Golden Age stars who reportedly earned Audie Murphy's deepest contempt. Hollywood icons whose behavior or attitudes so thoroughly violated the combat veteran's moral code that he refused to work with them, associate with them, or in some cases, even remain in the same room.
Imagine being at home now. Peaceful and quiet, nothing.
1. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler with dark shadows. Errol Flynn embodied swashbuckling heroism on screen, playing characters who fought for justice and defended the innocent in films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood. According to multiple sources close to Murphy, this carefully crafted heroic image stood in stark contrast to Flynn's actual character, a contradiction the combat veteran found particularly offensive. Rumors of German sympathies, statutory rape charges, and an arrogant disregard for veterans confirmed a former Universal executive who witnessed Murphy's reaction when Flynn's name came up during a potential project discussion. Audie refused to work with Flynn and once allegedly called him everything I fought against overseas. Murphy's objections to Flynn reportedly centered around several aspects of the actor's life and character. Flynn's well-documented sympathies for Germany in the years before America entered World War II particularly disturbed the combat veteran who had witnessed firsthand the horrors of the regime Flynn had apparently admired. According to those who knew Murphy well, he viewed such sympathies not as forgivable political naivete, but as fundamental moral corruption. Flynn thought war was costume drama. Audie knew better, recalled a fellow actor who worked with both men at different times. For Murphy, Flynn's romanticized view of fascism wasn't just ignorant, it was a direct insult to the men who died fighting Hitler's regime. Audie couldn't separate the charming screen persona from the man who had expressed admiration for what Murphy had risked his life to destroy. Beyond political views, Flynn's personal behavior reportedly contributed to Murphy's contempt. The swashbuckling star's 1942 trial for statutory rape, though he was acquitted, and his general reputation for predatory behavior toward young women violated Murphy's old-fashioned views on proper conduct and respect. As a man who had witnessed extraordinary female courage among resistance fighters in Europe, Murphy allegedly found Flynn's treatment of women particularly disturbing. Audie came from a generation and background where protecting the vulnerable was a fundamental measure of manhood, explained a longtime friend. Flynn's behavior with young women and girls represented exactly the kind of predatory exploitation Murphy had fought against. Power used to take advantage of the weak rather than to protect them. Perhaps most unforgivable to Murphy was Flynn's avoidance of military service during World War II, remaining in Hollywood making adventure films while his contemporaries fought and died overseas. Flynn received a 4F classification, unfit for service, for various health issues, including a heart condition, malaria, and tuberculosis. While these medical exemptions were technically legitimate, Murphy reportedly viewed them skeptically given Flynn's highly physical performances in action films made during the same period. The contrast was just too stark for Audie, noted a director who knew both men. Here was Flynn playing heroic warriors on screen while avoiding actual combat through medical exemptions that seemed conveniently inconsistent with his vigorous on-screen athletics. For someone who had experienced real combat, this kind of play acting at heroism while avoiding its reality was worse than cowardice. It was exploitation of the genuine sacrifice others were making. This combination of factors, political sympathies antithetical to American values, problematic personal behavior, and perceived avoidance of military obligation, reportedly placed Flynn at the top of Murphy's private list of Hollywood figures he genuinely despised. According to those close to him, Murphy maintained this assessment throughout his life, refusing to soften his judgment, even as others in Hollywood forgave or overlooked Flynn's controversial aspects in appreciation of his talent. The next name on Murphy's list represents a different kind of contempt, directed at one of Hollywood's most celebrated method actors, whose anti-American attitudes reportedly earned the war hero's lasting disdain.
It was a very tough decision to make because I can't think of a director that's better than Gaj Kazan. To me, he is the best director.
2. Marlon Brando, the method actor's anti-American methods. Marlon Brando revolutionized acting with his raw, naturalistic performances in films like A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront. His method approach and emotional intensity earned him critical acclaim and industry respect that continue to this day. Yet according to those close to Audie Murphy, the combat veteran maintained a deep, unshakable contempt for Brando, not for his talent, which Murphy reportedly acknowledged, but for his politics, conduct, and perceived disrespect for the country Murphy had nearly died defending. Mocked American politics, dodged the draft, and refused to portray patriotism on screen. confirmed a writer who worked with Murphy on several projects and heard his unfiltered opinions about Brando. These weren't casual disagreements for Audie. They represented a fundamental value conflict that he couldn't and wouldn't overlook, regardless of Brando's artistic accomplishments. Murphy's objections to Brando reportedly centered around the actor's increasingly vocal criticism of American policies and institutions during the 1950s and early 1960s. While many of Brando's positions would later become mainstream during the social upheavals of the late 1960s, his early advocacy for civil rights and criticism of American foreign policy placed him well outside conventional Hollywood opinions during the height of the Cold War, a period when Murphy's combat-forged patriotism remained unwavering. Murphy reportedly said, "He thinks he's deep, he's just disrespectful," recalled a fellow actor who witnessed Murphy's reaction when Brando's name came up during a social gathering. This wasn't just political disagreement. For Audie, Brando's criticisms of America represented a personal attack on everything he and his fallen comrades had fought to protect. Beyond political differences, Murphy reportedly objected to Brando's avoidance of military service during the Korean War. While Brando was classified 4F due to a knee injury from football, Murphy, who had overcome his own physical limitations to serve with distinction, allegedly viewed this exemption with the same skepticism he applied to Flynn's medical deferment, particularly given Brando's physically demanding performances on stage and screen during the same period. "Audie served with real men. Brando just acted like one," observed a veteran who knew Murphy during this period. For someone who had experienced genuine combat brotherhood, Brando's method-acting approach to portraying soldiers or tough guys while avoiding actual military service seemed profoundly inauthentic, play-acting at experiences that Murphy and his comrades had lived for real. Perhaps most fundamentally, Murphy reportedly objected to what he perceived as Brando's attitude toward traditional American values and institutions. As an actor who had fought and nearly died for American principles, Murphy allegedly found Brando's counterculture leanings and questioning of established norms not intellectually courageous, but morally suspect, a luxury afforded by the very freedoms that combat veterans like Murphy had sacrificed to preserve. "There was this fundamental collision of worldviews," explained a director who knew both men. "Murphy believed in America's essential goodness and the necessity of defending it without question. Brando questioned everything and saw criticism as the highest form of patriotism. These perspectives were irreconcilable, and Murphy, with his combat-forged certainty, had zero patience for what he viewed as Brando's privileged critiques from the safety of Hollywood." This principled objection to Brando's values and conduct reportedly led Murphy to refuse any projects involving the method actor, despite the potential career advantages such collaborations might have offered. For Murphy, professional advancement was never worth compromising the principles for which he had fought and for which many of his friends had died. The next targets of Murphy's contempt weren't individual actors, but a collective that embodied everything the combat veteran found distasteful about Hollywood's elite social circles.
Say that you'd made most of your reputation in movies.
I would say our guest is well known for his...
3. Sinatra's Rat Pack, especially Peter Lawford, the Hollywood elites Murphy despised. Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack, including Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop, and Peter Lawford, epitomized Hollywood cool in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Their Las Vegas performances, films, and notorious partying created an image of sophisticated rebellion that captivated America. According to those close to Audie Murphy, however, the combat veteran viewed this celebrated group with undisguised contempt, a disdain reportedly directed particularly toward Peter Lawford, whose political connections through marriage to Patricia Kennedy seemed especially problematic to the straightforward war hero. Murphy hated Hollywood's mob-connected elite, confirmed a former studio publicist who worked with both Murphy and several Rat Pack members. For Audie, their whole act represented everything wrong with celebrity culture: superficial, self-indulgent, and disconnected from the values he had fought to defend. Murphy's objections to the Rat Pack reportedly centered around several aspects of their public image and private behavior. Their celebrated drinking, womanizing, and carousing violated Murphy's old-fashioned moral code, which valued discipline, fidelity, and respect for women. While Murphy himself struggled with post-traumatic stress and occasional alcohol abuse, Those close to him claim he viewed his own weaknesses as failings to overcome rather than badges of honor to celebrate. He believed Lawford used political power for ego, not honor, and refused to attend Rat Pack parties, explained a producer who invited Murphy to several events where Rat Pack members would be present. Audie had a particular contempt for how Lawford leveraged his Kennedy family connections. For someone who had earned every achievement through blood and sacrifice, watching Lawford parlay marriage into access and influence struck Murphy as fundamentally unmanly. Beyond their hedonistic lifestyle, Murphy reportedly objected to the Rat Pack's connections to organized crime figures, particularly Sinatra's well-documented relationships with mob leaders. For a combat veteran who had risked everything to defend American institutions, these casual associations with criminals represented a betrayal of the very system he had fought to protect. If you needed 12 drinks to be interesting, Audie didn't want to meet you sober, recalled a fellow actor who knew Murphy's unfiltered opinions. This wasn't just personal distaste, it was a fundamental judgment about character. Murphy had seen men reveal their true nature under the most extreme pressure imaginable. He had no patience for celebrities who needed alcohol, women, and entourages to manufacture a personality. Murphy's contempt for the Rat Pack reportedly went beyond mere disapproval to active avoidance. According to multiple sources, he refused numerous invitations to events where they would be present, declined film projects that involved them, and made no secret of his disdain among trusted associates. When pressed for reasons, Murphy allegedly cited both moral objections to their lifestyle and practical concerns about their professionalism. There was this incident where Murphy was approached about a potential film with Sinatra, recalled a former agent. Audie didn't even let the pitch finish before saying, "I fought alongside men who depended on each other for survival. I won't work with men who can't even show up to set on time because they've been up all night drinking." It wasn't just moral judgment, it was a veteran's insistence on basic reliability and discipline. What made Murphy's contempt for the Rat Pack particularly notable was its immunity to the group's immense cultural influence. At a time when association with Sinatra's circle represented the pinnacle of Hollywood social status, Murphy's willingness to openly reject that world demonstrated the genuine independence of his character, a man whose standards were formed in combat and remained impervious to shifting social trends or career advantages. The next name on Murphy's list reveals that even Hollywood's toughest-looking stars could be found wanting when judged by the standards of a genuine combat hero. 4. Kirk Douglas. When Hollywood toughness met real warrior judgment. Kirk Douglas built his career playing intense, often tormented characters whose forceful personalities dominated everyone around them, a screen presence that made him one of Hollywood's most bankable tough guy stars from the late 1940s through the 1960s. According to those close to Audie Murphy, however, the combat veteran saw through Douglas's carefully constructed image to what he considered the less admirable reality beneath, a perspective uniquely informed by Murphy's experiences with genuine leadership under life-or-death circumstances. Known for stepping on co-stars, yelling at crew, and demanding top billing, confirmed a director who worked with both men during the 1950s. While audiences and most of Hollywood bought into Douglas's tough guy persona, Murphy viewed his behavior through a completely different lens, comparing it not to other actors but to the officers and sergeants he'd served with in combat. Murphy's objections to Douglas reportedly centered around what he perceived as the fundamental inauthenticity of the actor's approach to both his craft and his relationships. Having experienced real leadership in combat situations where genuine strength meant protecting others rather than dominating them, Murphy allegedly found Douglas's treatment of colleagues particularly revealing of character flaws rather than strength. Murphy allegedly said, "He doesn't act, he performs power trips," recalled a fellow actor who worked with both men. This wasn't professional jealousy. Murphy had no interest in the kind of stardom Douglas pursued. It was a judgment from someone who had witnessed true strength under the most extreme circumstances imaginable and found Douglas's version hollow by comparison. Beyond professional behavior, Murphy reportedly objected to what he considered Douglas's self-aggrandizing approach to his Jewish heritage and his military service during World War II. While Douglas eventually became more open about his Jewish background and served honorably in the Navy during the war, Murphy allegedly felt that Douglas's selective emphasis on these aspects of his biography, when professionally advantageous, represented a form of exploitation that disrespected both genuine religious commitment and, more significant, military sacrifice. Audie respected strength, not cruelty, explained a longtime friend of Murphy's. Having commanded men in combat situations where lives depended on his decisions, Murphy had seen how genuine leadership involved sacrifice for others rather than self-promotion. Douglas's approach to stardom, demanding the spotlight, taking credit, dominating others, represented everything Murphy had learned to despise in poor officers he'd encountered during the war. This assessment reportedly extended beyond Douglas's on-set behavior to his approach to roles themselves. According to those familiar with Murphy's views, he found Douglas's performances technically impressive but fundamentally inauthentic, portraying strength through intensity and volume rather than the quiet competence Murphy had witnessed in genuinely effective combat leaders. There was this screening where Murphy watched Douglas in a war film, recalled a studio executive. Afterward, Audie just shook his head and said, "Real heroes don't need to convince everyone they're heroes." It was a devastating critique from someone who actually knew the difference, who had seen both posturing and genuine courage under fire, and could instantly distinguish between them. Murphy's judgment of Douglas reportedly remained consistent throughout his career, unaffected by Douglas's immense popularity or critical acclaim. For the combat veteran, no amount of Hollywood success could compensate for what he perceived as fundamental character flaws, a perspective formed through experiences where true character had life or death consequences. The next Hollywood figure on Murphy's list represents a different kind of contempt, directed at an actor whose nihilistic worldview stood in stark contrast to the values the combat veteran had risked his life to defend.
Rain had stopped. Timidly the sun came out, and the little town awakened to its sleepy day.
5. George Sanders, the sophisticated cynic who earned a warrior's scorn. George Sanders specialized in playing sophisticated, cynical villains whose cultured exteriors masked cruel intentions. According to those close to Audie Murphy, the combat veteran believed this screen persona wasn't merely acting, but a reflection of Sanders's authentic character, a nihilistic worldview that stood in fundamental opposition to everything Murphy had fought to defend during World War II. Arrogant, nihilistic, and often dismissive of American ideals, confirmed a writer who worked with both actors and witnessed Murphy's unfiltered reaction when Sanders' name came up during a production discussion. While many in Hollywood found Sanders' world-weary European sophistication charming or amusing, Murphy viewed it through the lens of someone who had nearly died defending values that Sanders casually dismissed. Murphy's objections to Sanders reportedly centered around the British actor's openly expressed contempt for concepts like patriotism, sacrifice, and moral conviction, values that formed the core of Murphy's worldview and had guided his extraordinary actions in combat. For someone who had witnessed men die for their beliefs, Sanders' cultivated cynicism represented not sophisticated worldliness, but moral bankruptcy. Audie once described him as a man who believed in nothing and made sure everyone knew it, recalled a director who had worked with both men. This wasn't just philosophical disagreement. For Murphy, who had risked everything for deeply held principles, Sanders' smirking dismissal of all values as equally meaningless was genuinely offensive, an insult to the sacrifice of everyone who had fought and died believing their actions mattered. Beyond his nihilistic philosophy, Sanders' affected superiority and dismissive attitude toward American culture reportedly troubled Murphy deeply. As someone who had witnessed extraordinary courage from ordinary American soldiers, farm boys, factory workers, and young men from every walk of life, Murphy allegedly found Sanders' condescension toward American values and institutions particularly galling. He played villains because it was the only honest thing about him, observed a production assistant who witnessed interactions between the two men. Murphy once said something like, "At least when Sanders plays cruel, dismissive characters, he's not pretending to be something he's not." It was a cutting assessment from someone who valued authenticity above almost everything else. What made Murphy's contempt for Sanders particularly significant was that it wasn't based on personal conflict or professional rivalry, but on fundamental values, a collision between Sanders' cultivated nihilism and Murphy's combat-forged moral certainty. Their occasional interactions on studio lots were reportedly characterized by mutual recognition of this unbridgeable philosophical divide. There was this moment at a studio event where Sanders was holding court, making his typical cynical observations about American optimism being naive, recalled an actress who witnessed the encounter. Murphy just looked at him for a moment and said, "I've held dying men who believed in something. What have you ever believed in?" Sanders had no response, perhaps the only time I ever saw him genuinely speechless. This philosophical opposition reportedly influenced Murphy's professional decisions, leading him to decline projects involving Sanders regardless of potential career benefits. For the combat veteran, no role was worth associating with someone whose worldview he considered not merely different, but fundamentally corrosive to the values he had fought to protect. The final name on Murphy's list reveals that even handsome leading men weren't exempt from the combat veteran's uncompromising judgment.
Never planned anything, everything has always been somewhat spontaneous, and I just let it happen.
6. Tony Curtis, the matinee idol with a fabricated service record. Tony Curtis transformed himself from Bernie Schwartz of the Bronx into one of Hollywood's most bankable leading men, starring in classics like Some Like It Hot and Spartacus. His striking good looks and eventual acting prowess made him a major star throughout the 1950s and 1960s. According to Hollywood insiders, however, Audie Murphy maintained a particular contempt for Curtis, not primarily for his acting abilities or professional conduct, but for what Murphy allegedly considered dishonesty about his military service during World War II. Murphy reportedly loathed Curtis's vanity and alleged he faked military credentials in interviews, confirmed a former publicist who worked with both actors. For someone who had earned every military decoration through blood and extraordinary courage, Curtis's perceived embellishment of his naval service struck Murphy as an unforgivable form of stolen valor. Curtis had indeed served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, primarily aboard the submarine tender USS Proteus. His service, while honorable, was notably less dramatic than the combat experiences Murphy endured in the European theater. According to those close to Murphy, what earned Curtis a place on the hero's blacklist wasn't his less eventful military record, but his alleged tendency to imply or suggest more dramatic service experiences in publicity materials and interviews. Called him all hair, no spine, recalled a makeup artist who worked with both men and witnessed Murphy's unfiltered opinions. This wasn't about Curtis having served in a support role rather than combat. Murphy respected all forms of legitimate service. What infuriated him was the perception that Curtis allowed or encouraged publicity materials that implied combat experiences he hadn't actually had. Beyond military matters, Murphy reportedly objected to what he considered Curtis's excessive vanity and preoccupation with his appearance, qualities the straightforward combat veteran found fundamentally unmanly. Coming from hardscrabble rural Texas and the brutal reality of infantry combat, Murphy allegedly had little patience for Curtis's elaborate grooming routines and carefully maintained image. "If you weren't willing to earn your uniform, Audie didn't want your handshake," explained a director who worked with both actors. Murphy had a particular contempt for what he viewed as Curtis's borrowed authenticity, not just regarding military service, but his entire transformation from Bernie Schwartz to Tony Curtis. For someone as fundamentally authentic as Murphy, this kind of self-reinvention seemed dishonest at a basic level. What made Murphy's assessment of Curtis particularly cutting was its focus on character rather than talent. According to those familiar with his views, Murphy acknowledged Curtis's abilities as a performer, but considered them irrelevant when weighed against what he perceived as fundamental dishonesty about matters the combat veteran held sacred. Audie could separate professional skill from personal character, noted a fellow actor who knew both men. He would admit Curtis had talent on screen, but would then immediately add something like, "Too bad he couldn't bring some of that authenticity to how he talks about his service." For Murphy, no amount of acting ability could compensate for misrepresenting military experience. This uncompromising judgment reportedly led Murphy to refuse any projects involving Curtis, decline social invitations where Curtis would be present, and make his contempt clear to trusted associates. While he rarely publicly criticized fellow actors,